So when we talk about the levels of homeostatic control, it can happen in many levels. For one thing, it can happen inside your cell, okay? Your cell has to keep itself healthy. Your cell has to produce its own energy. Your cell has to decide which genes are going to be transcribed and what proteins are going to be made. So that is one level of control, okay? There's also intrinsic control, auto-regulation, okay? Auto-regulation means that it's already all set up and it's all a system that keeps going. For example, inside your kidneys, if there is too much fluid going through your kidney, then the pressure could actually damage the microstructures inside the kidney, and then you'd end up having to go on dialysis, okay? So your body is already set up so that if it senses there's too much pressure, it's going to reduce the amount of fluid that comes into the kidney, okay? So that's intrinsic control. Extrinsic control is another component, and the example I have for this one is digestion, okay? It involves a lot of organs, okay? So many of the enzymes that digest your food are not made in the stomach or in the intestine themselves. They're actually made elsewhere, and they're transported into the intestine so that you can digest your food, okay? So you can have extrinsic control where you actually have control going through several systems and several organs of the body, okay? And this says may involve endocrine signals. Endocrine means hormones. That doesn't always mean sex hormones. There's also other kinds of hormones in your body, okay? Okay. I also mentioned the word pathways. So when we talk about pathways, most of the time we are talking intracellular, okay? And if you look at this, and we're going to actually talk about this more in just a minute, you're talking about a pathway where something outside the cell, a ligand or a ligand, depending on where you were raised, is going to attach to the cell and start a messenger system inside the cell to make a change, okay? So when we talk about pathways, we're usually talking about this kind of a pathway, okay? And we're going to talk a little more about that later. We also talked about relationships, okay? So physiology is about relationships. We're going to talk about this when we talk about the lungs and when we talk about breathing. But there is a relationship between the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, okay? And what happens is, depending on whether or not there's more oxygen or more carbon dioxide, it actually makes it easier for it to bind, okay? Makes it easier for it to bind to your red blood cells and get carried in or out of the body. So when we get to this part, we'll talk about this in detail, but the idea is just for you to see that it makes a difference whether there's one or the other. So there's a relationship between the two of them, okay? Okay. So disease happens on every level of your body, and you may not even think about that, but I'm going to give you some examples. On a molecular level, cystic fibrosis affects your entire body, but it's actually because of one, it can be multiple errors, but usually it's just one error in a gene, okay? So that actually affects each cell in the body, and then that affects the entire body. You can also have cellular level, so that it's affecting cells in a certain way or a certain group. Cholesterolemia, having high cholesterol, which is sometimes hereditary, is one of those disorders, okay? We need cholesterol. It's part of every cell, but sometimes there's too much, okay? On an organ level, you can have something happen to an organ. Cardiomyopathy means that you've had damage to the heart muscle. Damage to the heart muscle, so that's on the organ level. You can also have disease that infects the entire organism, okay? Metabolic syndrome is something that happens when you start to have dysfunction all over your body. That's when you start to get diabetes 2, which is the insulin resistance, and usually there is obesity that goes with it, and there's high blood pressure that goes with it, and there's a whole bunch of symptoms that affect your whole body, and that is because of metabolic syndrome, which is a disorder for the entire organism, okay? So, One last thing I need to tell you about in your introduction to physiology is to remember this is a science, okay? And science changes, okay? And the same way that you probably roll your eyes when your grandma tells you some old folk tale, okay, is the same way that somebody's going to look at you if you don't realize that the science does change. So whatever it is that you are learning about now, like, for example, how the drugs work that we use in medicine, you may find out later that they've discovered new information about how they work or that they work in a different way than they thought, okay? So this is just a reminder that we have a scientific method and that you are going to always be challenged to try and keep up with new information that's coming in. So if you have some guy come to your practice and he's a drug representative and he says to you, oh, we have the latest and the greatest, and here's this new drug, and we think you should give it to your patients. We'll even give you some free ones so that you could hand it out to them. And then you're going to say to them, well, how does it work? And then they're going to say, oh, well, you know, it's for your eyes, but you take it and it works in your liver and it's going to make your eyes better. Now, you are going to know, because you are going to know physiology, whether that's possible or not, okay? This is the kind of stuff I hear all the time, okay? Oh, it's going to make your liver better and then it's going to make your eye better. Well, can that happen or not? How about if you rub something on the outside of your knee? Is it going to take away the quote-unquote water inside your knee? So what you're going to learn to do is you're going to learn to listen respectfully, but with a shade of doubt until you process it through your own mind and say, yes, that's possible, or no, that's not possible, okay? That's what you're going to do. So that you are not listening to somebody else tell you what is the best way for something to work in the body. You are going to be the physician. You are the one who's going to say, that's possible or that's not possible. So I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues came up to me and she said the doctor told her that she could get rid of her headaches if she slapped her back. Okay? You see Chinese people doing this stuff all the time. Okay? Now, if you took anatomy and if you take physiology, then you will know that the primary blood flow to the head comes from where? Side of the neck. Do you think there's much back there that's going up into your head? Okay, so you see how your knowledge will help you evaluate the claims that other people have. And it will help you decide if something's possible or not. Okay? You may not have all the details, but you'll at least know the basics that'll say, yes, I could do that, or yes, that's not going to work. Okay? Okay. So, what we're going to do right now is we're going to have a short introductory lecture about cells. And we have 2 little videos to go with it, and then we'll be done. You will notice as we go through these that our chapters are not necessarily in order. We are following the order of the chapters in the Chinese physiology book, okay, which doesn't exactly match up to the way that the chapters are ordered in our book. So if you ever have a question, try to look at the topics that I list, because that will tell you where it is. Sometimes I also list the chapter numbers for either the number 5 or number 6, but just look at the topics, and that'll be your best bet. Okay? So some of this is going to be review if you've had a good cell membrane class or a good cellular biology class. Just a reminder of a few things that we're going to be talking about extensively. Nucleus, where your DNA is, which is going to be where the DNA is transcribed into RNA. You've got your rough endoplasmic reticulum and your Golgi apparatus where the proteins are modified. We're going to talk a lot about the cell membrane, which you will remember. There's also a series of spindles and cytoskeleton, that actually help the structure of the cell. It's like the skeleton inside the cell, and also creates pathways for those proteins to come down from the Golgi into the other parts of the cell. When we talk about metabolism, we'll talk extensively about the mitochondria and the ATP and the electron transport chain. I'm sure a lot of these words are things that you'll remember that you've heard before, but that's a little review for you if you have forgotten any of that as you start to study, okay? So we are going to talk a lot about the plasma membrane because of the fact that it has some really important jobs. One of the things that you see on this is that we have a variety of things going on inside of the plasma membrane. First of all, we have 2 layers of phospholipids, okay? The little yellow ones there are the cholesterol. They actually give structure, like a firmness, you might say, to the cell membrane so that it stays together well. We have got proteins that go all the way through. Oftentimes, these are transporters or channels. And we have also got what we call associated peripheral membrane proteins. They actually modify the action of the protein that goes through, okay? Frequently on the extracellular side, there is carbohydrates. These are sugar chains. We're going to use them as feelers. That's really what they are. They're going to be sensors that are going to help tell the inside of the cell what is going on, okay? Okay, so as you'll remember, and this is a really important point, every cell has got a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic region. Hydro, water, phobic, afraid, right? Doesn't like it. Hydrophilic means it likes the water, okay? So we start off with the hydrophilic part on the outside, and we have the hydrophobic part on the inside, okay? So it doesn't like water. If you think about fat and water, if you think about salad dressing with oil and water, you can see that they don't like each other, they don't mix. Okay, so there's 2 ways for something to go through this membrane. It can be passive or it can be active. And the difference is whether or not there is energy used by the cell, okay? So if we're talking about passive, it can be diffusion, which just is a spreading out of molecules. If you are, say, walking past the cafeteria and you smell the food, that's diffusion, right? Because the food molecules have moved out and are going to continue to move out as far as they can until you can't smell them anymore, okay? If your mother was cooking bread, you would smell it in your bedroom, but it might be 10 or 15 minutes after it came out of the oven, right? Depending on how far away you are, okay? That is diffusion. And that means the molecules are moving from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, okay? Naturally just spreading out until they reach an equilibrium, okay? So that is diffusion. Okay, if we have sugar in a glass, and if we start off with an actual sugar cube, by the time, if we give it enough time, it'll spread out evenly, okay? It'll create equilibrium in the glass. Okay, now you remember that we have a cell membrane, and that cell membrane is called semi-permeable. Semi-permeable means that some things get through and others don't, okay? And if you look at this, you see that if you start off with unequal amounts, sorry. If you start off with unequal amounts of sugar, or in this case it just says solute, so solute always means the actual molecules, the actual molecules. If you start off with an uneven amount, it will eventually move until you have even on both sides. Okay? And in this example, both the water moves and the actual particles move. Okay? So that means that this membrane is letting the solutes through. All right? The thing about our actual cell molecules is because of that hydrophobic section, it means that they don't like molecules that have relationships to water, okay? But they do like lipids. They do like fat molecules because they're made out of fat, okay? So that means that if something is made out of fat, it is going to diffuse through more quickly, okay? A good example of this is sex hormones. Those are they're made out of lipids. They start with a cholesterol base, and they will go through the membrane and inside the cell. Okay? Okay. So they will diffuse more quickly than something that is water. If you look over on the side of here, it actually gives you some ideas of what you're talking about in terms of whether or not it goes through or not. So if you have oxygen, it's going to go through. If you have a charged ion, which in our body we're always talking about sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, magnesium, bicarbonate. What else is on there? Hydrogen. Then they're not going to go through. They're not going to go through because in the reality, those little ions are actually surrounded by water. So that's why they don't go through. Okay? They don't go through because they actually are not going to be liked by the hydrophobic part. Okay? And of course, if they get too big, if they're a full-size protein, there's just not that big of a hole for them to go through. So if it's something like glucose, it's not going to go through because there's just not that much space. Okay? Okay. So when we talk about osmosis, people get very confused about osmosis. When we say the word osmosis, we are talking about the movement of water, okay? We are not talking about the movement of the solutes, okay? We're not talking about the solutes moving at all. We are only talking about water, okay? So osmotic pressure is water pressure, okay? If we're talking about osmotic pressure, we're talking about water pressure. So we're talking about a membrane that will selectively let the water through, but not the solutes, okay? So what happens when we talk about osmolarity is we're talking about the movement of the water, okay? But the solutes don't get to follow. So in this example, albumin is a protein, okay? And on one side we have 5% albumin, the other side we've got 10% albumin. Now, these are exactly the same amount. Okay, so if you have a container with a fixed amount and one side has more protein and one side has less protein, which side has more water? The one with the less protein. The protein takes up space. The water takes up space. If each one is exactly the same amount of space, then the higher protein is going to take space away from the water, right? Okay, so there's more water on this side, and it's going to want to diffuse until it reaches equilibrium, okay? So that means the water is going to move. And when I talk about osmotic pressure or water pressure, it's simply the pressure of making the water move. So there's more osmotic pressure on the side with less solutes, okay? So the water's going to move, and then we're going to end up with equilibrium. But what we didn't end up with is equal amounts because the solutes did not move. Only the water moved, okay? So we have less water here, more water here, but they're now the same percentage, okay? So there's even amount of water distributed around the solids. And I think here we go. I have a little movie for you. We will see if it works inside, and if it doesn't, then we will do it the other way.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and today I'm going to show you a quick little osmosis demo. that I set up in my classroom. But before I do that, I should probably talk a little bit about what osmosis is. And so osmosis is simply diffusion, or the movement of water from an area of high water concentration to low water concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. So what does that mean? Well, if you look right here in this U-tube, that's what this is called, this would be a semi-permeable membrane. And what that means is it only allows a few things to move through. And so you can see right here that the water molecules are small enough that they can pass through, but the solute molecules aren't. Solute molecules could be sugar, could be ions, but essentially you can't make it through. They're too big. And so in relation to this side, the left side here we would call the hypertonic side. What hypertonic means is greater levels of solutes. And that means over on here, this in relation is going to be called the hypotonic solution. In other words, there's greater solute concentration on this side than there is over here. And so these are in relation to each other. And so what does that really mean? Well, if we were to zoom in at the molecular level, all of the water molecules are going to actually stick to this solute. So the water molecules are going to grab onto that. And since the water molecules are grabbing onto the solutes, there's not going to be a lot of water on this side. And so we're going to say that the hypertonic side is actually going to be an area where there's low water concentration. So over here there's less solute, so there's less water molecules grabbing onto the solutes, and so the water is going to flow in that direction. And so however you want to think about it, is the water flowing from an area of high water concentration to low, or is the water flowing towards a hypertonic area? Either of those, it doesn't matter as long as you know which way the water is going to flow. And so what's going to happen to the water? Well, the water is eventually going to flow over to the side until the concentration of water on either side of that semi-permeable membrane is exactly the same. At this point, we would say on either side it is now isotonic, if I can spell that right. Isotonic means that water is still flowing back and forth, but it's flowing back at an equal rate. Now, if you were to think about this, if you were to watch this, it would seem somewhat magical as the water is just moving up on this side, just kind of against gravity and dropping on this side because you can't see the solutes, and so that's pretty cool. So let me show you the setup that I did in class. In this osmosis demo, find a good color. Right here I have dialysis tubing. Dialysis tubing has these tiny little holes in it, and so if I were to trace it out, we've got dialysis tubing here, kind of tied it in a knot at the bottom, and so it goes all the way up here. And then as we move up, the dialysis tubing is empty up here, but it's tied all the way up to a big ring stand at the top. So the dialysis tubing is filled down here. Now what's it filled with? It's filled with corn syrup here. And so that corn syrup is going to have a high concentration of solute. In this case, it's going to be sucrose or sugar. Outside of that, right out here, we have water. We have distilled water. And so if we look at these two in relation to each other, which of the following is hypertonic and which of the following is hypotonic? Well, the hypertonic is going to be the area with more sugar or more solute. And so in this case, that's going to be the corn syrup. And so we should have a flow of water in that direction. And so I'm going to turn on the video and then speed it up a little bit and so you can watch it and so you can see the magic of osmosis.
If I say the word tonic, I am talking about the solute. So if I say hypertonic, high solute. Hypotonic, low solute. But what if I say hyperosmotic? Now I'm talking about the water, right? Water. So don't get confused about which thing is being asked. If it's osmotic, it's about the water. If it's tonic, it's about the solute.